Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. My name is Mr. Aegis. I will be your host for this TKF Seminar Series. If you are not familiar with the Knowledge Fellowship, we are an educational collective, a group of educational streamers, and the TKF group exists to highlight, promote, and empower educational streamers to get their content out there in a world full of, slop content, as we know, is all most people get to see. We want to help promote substantive content and to highlight the excellent streamers in the Knowledge Fellowship group. We started the Seminar Series, where we bring on one of our excellent members and we highlight what they do. We talk about their educational content, and we're going to do that in just a moment. We're going to bring on our guest for today. General Stee is an archaeologist, historian, so we're going to talk about that. First, I just want to say thank you all so much for supporting TKF. Those of you who have been attending our seminar series. As you may know, we have streamers in virtually every kind of topic: math and economics, social sciences, history, language, programming, technology, practical skills, just about anything you can imagine that you might want to learn about. There is a streamer in TKF that you can watch basically anytime. You can check the stream group, the Twitch group, in my bio, in the bios of all of the TKF streamers. I guarantee you there is always someone streaming something interesting and informative that you can check out. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on our guest today. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the seminars today.
How fitting for an Irishman to be talked about the meat and potatoes.
Are the meat and potatoes today. So the first thing that I think we should do, for those of you who are in the chat but don't know our guest, tell us what it is you do in your streams.
What do I do? That's a great question. Maybe you should ask my community. They might have a better understanding of it than me. It's like an out-of-body experience until I finish and I glance over the VOD and I'm like, oh, that's what I did today. No, I stream in order to kind of, I suppose, balance gameplay and historical gameplay and games that I want to play with a space in which history and archaeology and open discussion can kind of flourish in and around nerdy content and gaming content and everything in between. My stream is not supposed to be the most professional historical aspect of my life. It's supposed to be the most accessible historical aspect of my life. So I'm fully open to people throwing a history question into chat at the same time that they might ask me about how I'm playing a particular city builder or a particular, historical game. So it's kind of a vehicle in which I balance that community aspect with that accessibility that history and education in general so desperately needs. So yeah. Absolutely.
And right off the bat, thank you to Study Pause for bringing your class on a field trip to ours. Feel free to let us know in the chat all about yourself. We have a shout out to you there. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Knowledge Fellowship stream, the Seminar Series. This is going to be a fairly interesting one because this is the second history-based TKF member that we've had on the Seminar Series. The first one was Melissa in Denial, for those of you who remember that and you know her, an Egyptologist. And now we have a historian with a emphasis on the Roman period. So a pretty interesting combination. And some questions might have some similar answers. And the first one I want to talk about, and one that's on my mind when I do the, everyone thinks about the Roman Empire, at least, once a week or so, that goes around.
Sure. Go on. I think I know what this is going to be.
It might not be. I don't know. What's the daily life for an average Roman citizen? Not a subject, daily life of a tip, not someone, in the lower or, aristocracy, but, a middling merchant, perhaps. What might their life be like?
I was wrong then. I thought you were going to ask me how many times I think about the Roman Empire a day.
Well, I'm sure for you it's pretty often, yeah.
It's all day, all of the work day. I'm sure I'm above average even for that arbitrary metric. But okay, I'm glad it wasn't that, or we kind of answered it anyway. But what is a day? Well, that depends. Like everything in history, you can give the simple answer, and it can be satisfactory. And sometimes it's enough. Sometimes Sometimes the simple answer, as long as it's factually correct, is enough. But as with every question in history, the actual answer is, well, it's complicated. And I think that's where I'm going to start off today, because I think we're in a space where people want to know the full answer, which is a merchant, as you say, as our hypothetical kind of plucking of a commoner from the Roman Empire, depends on kind of four main variables. So, where are you, first of all? Secondly, what era are you born into? Thirdly, are you a citizen or are you not? And then fourthly, are you making, in this instance with a merchant, are you making your living from within the Roman Empire trading out, or are you making your living from outside the Roman Empire trading in? And those four questions change the answer dramatically. So, for example, if you were, let's take it that the most simplistic one. Let's say you're a merchant in Rome in the early imperial period, and you're a Roman citizen. Well, that's going to be nice and easy. So your daily life is going to consist of you doing your job, paying your taxes, hoping your sons don't have to go off to war, and hoping that you can afford a tomb big enough that you can be remembered in some way, shape, or form. And that's pretty much what it is. When it comes to somebody who's not a citizen, who's a freedman, we have one, famous one, Tomb of the Baker from outside Rome, which talks about a baker, and he basically built his tomb looking like a collection of bakery ovens. And it talks mainly about his pride in going from being a freedman into being somebody who could guarantee his family citizenship, and who could basically afford a tomb that was big enough to be placed right by the city gates. So he was a well-to-do middle commoner, you know. And that's an interesting story. That's a fascinating story of somebody who's able to rise up through the ranks. And that's something that the Roman Republic and Empire is known for in a lot of ways. It's this kind of ascendant and descendant, it works both ways, ascendant and descendant structure in which people can move. And I'm not talking about the cursus honorum, I'm not talking about the political offices. I'm talking about the kind of social mobility that can happen within the empire based on arbitrary factors and honestly personal determination. And then you have, let's take an outlier. Let's take it as you're a trader in Britain, in modern day England, Scotland, Wales, or indeed, as I've looked into myself and had an awful lot of dealings with, let's say you're a trader in Ireland, interestingly, a place that was never conquered by the empire, a place that was never touched militarily by the empire, and you're trading into it. Well, that's going to occur in a very specific time frame, and that's going to structure your connections with the empire, and it's also going to structure your social status in your own community. We see this in northeastern Spain an awful lot, in what the Romans called Celtiberia, where an awful lot of social structures are actually determined by your proximity of connection to the Roman officials, and that can be for good or for bad. So maybe if you're interacting and selling and trading and interacting generally with Romans in a society that is not yet acclimatized to that, it can be seen as a pejorative factor, and it might actually hinder your social development. Whereas if you're in an area that is of high hybridity within the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, maybe being able to demonstrate your overlap with the Roman political system and to be able to demonstrate your wealth in Roman ways, as opposed to, let's say, in Celtiberia, where they tend to demonstrate their wealth with the equine industry, with horses. If you're able to channel your wealth into denarii and sesterci, and you're able to build a forum and demonstrate your Romanness in ways, that can often be a plus. So that's a very long-winded answer to tell you that it really depends, and it holds an awful lot of weight in different ways, depending on where, when, and how you're interacting.
I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing I want to hear. I love the long answer. And it brings me to the kind of thing I was talking about with Melissa. We talk about, what was the life like, for example, for an Egyptian. She's like, well, I mean, there's like 2,000 years worth of ancient Egypt. When are you talking about? People kind of there's, we consciously know the Roman Empire lasted a very long time, but then we don't think those are some pretty distinct eras. And you were,
yeah. I mean, we even call it the Roman Empire, and technically the empire is a very specific period in and of itself, and yet then we talk about the Roman Republic, which is the era that I mainly focus in, and then you've got the Roman monarchy period, and then you've got the pre-monarchy period, which is just Iron Age Italy by another metric, and then you've got late antiquity, which is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But for other periods of history, it's the rise of the Byzantine Empire. So, you have overlap all the time. The crisis of the 3rd century, which is, really what should be the high point of the Roman imperial period. And it turns out to be a crisis point, obviously. And so, there's a million different names for different periods, depending on how you're studying it. An awful lot of books that talk about these periods in a general sense often talk about like Iron Age Italy, and then go into Roman Italy, this concept of like Roman becoming a temporal definition rather than a socio-political definition. So you have like Roman Italy rather than Italy during the Roman period, which it seems like such a nuance, and it seems unimportant. But when an entity, a socio-political entity, becomes the definition of a temporal period, it changes our perspective, right? Because now it's not the Romans in a location, it's how that location changes within the span of what is Rome. And that's an incredibly different and yet subtle differentiation between the two things, and yet it can change totally how you write a book or how you write an article, and the perspective and the goals that you're trying to achieve in that, and these like sweeping histories, which I think are great in some circumstances and also too broad in others, but they have to be done at some point. I just see a question in chat there. Yes, I have watched HBO's Rome. It's one of my favorite shows of all time. So yeah.
Monsignor 1453, worst year of my life.
Yeah, I remember it well.
Oh, the good old days.
Yeah, so yeah, that temporal definition is really important. Not only for careers, but also in respect to like understanding periods and understanding history. I think knowing when you mean is as important as knowing like what you're talking about. You can't generalize over multiple periods. Generalizations are the bane of historians.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you said brings up the question that I didn't really think about ahead of time, but the sort of cultural hegemony, the way that if we look at the modern period, the United States has been sort of cultural victory in that everyone is sort of, in a way, how Americanized is the other country in relation to us. And that's sort of how Americans think of other countries.
Sure.
One of the things you said, how integrated are you into Roman society? I think of some of the few things I know are like Judean history of not very integrated, and sort of during most of the period they're sort of outside and not wanting to integrate, and people who did have connection with the Roman Empire, people who had become tax collectors, it was, the word you used was a pejorative. It was sort of a bad thing to be seen as working with the Romans.
It can be, yeah, it can be. It depends. Again, you're going to hear me say this like 15 times today. It depends. But it does depend. So I want to make it, because you and perhaps a large portion of the chat don't know this, but I will avoid the term Romanization like the plague. And I think people should. I think Romanization is a term that was coined in the 20th century and the late 19th century. That is basically a synonym for colonization in the British imperial sense of the word, not the Greek colonial sense of the word. They're two different things. It's like the word tyrant in the ancient world. In the classical Greek world, tyrant means something totally different than it does today. And I mean that's not hyperbole. It means something totally different. And really the word that we think of as tyrant is more understood by how the Romans understood the Latin word rex for king. It's like somebody who comes to power regardless of those opinions around them, somebody who controls no matter what. And Romanization carries the same weight. It's a term that gets used to sweep cultural identity and cultural individualism under the carpet very quickly, and it became coined too fast and too hard for a long time. And academics, including myself, actively try to move away from this word. So what the process you're describing, this like almost Americanization of the world, to use your own example, the easiest way to talk about that is to talk about quote unquote Romanization, but I won't give it the airtime. It's not how we should think about this period. The Romans survived 1,000 years because they were masters of symbiosis. They knew when not to be. And they also were very capable of choosing not to be. But at the end of the day, they were masters of symbiotic relationships. And that usually, not always, but usually required buy-in of some capacity, top down or bottom up, or ideally both. In fact, in the mid-Republican period, often Rome in its conquest, in its expansion, let's say, across the Italian peninsula and Sicily and Corsica and Sardinia, and to the north in the Po Valley and beyond in Transalpine Gaul, it was needed, not just preferential, it was needed to maintain the status quo in a region. If you had a cultural hegemon in a Greek city-state like Tarentum, at that stage it was the Greek name Taras, nowadays it's modern Taranto. Rome actively tries, we have this multiple times, Rome actively tries to keep them in place, but just change kind of their cultural facing, how they're responding to Rome as a cultural entity, rather than completely eradicating it. Now, Taras is both a perfect example of this and a perfect example of what happens when you don't do it, because Taras was sacked twice and eventually eradicated, and the city of Neptunia was put there beside it. Taras is in southern Italy, by the way, if anyone doesn't know where Tarentum is, on the instep of the heel of Italy. It's just the Bay of Taranto. You can look it up nowadays. Beautiful city to go to. Great museums, and they make great pizza there as well. It's not far from modern day Bari. But this is a great example of one of these city-states. It was a cultural hegemon in the region. It was established by Dionysius I of Syracuse. It was not established by them. It was established by the Spartans during the Greek colonizing period. But Dionysius I of Syracuse came in and established Taras as the hegemon in the region. When he couldn't control southern Italy, he left Taras there and decided that they were to take over. We have it as according to Polybius and various other sources as well in sporadic accounts, that Taras was left as this hegemon of a league, this Italiote league in southern Italy. And when Rome comes into contact with Taras and with this Italiote league, Magna Graecia, exactly, Monsignor, exactly. When Rome comes into contact with Taras, it's very different. It's very unexpected as to how this Romanization term would suggest we should imagine this interaction would go. But Rome actually plays kind of chess with Taras diplomatically for quite some time. And then it's only at the beginning of the 3rd century that Rome starts to kind of insist upon Taras behaving a certain way. Taras refuses, Rome sacks the city, Taras kind of gets a kicking for the better part of 50 years then, and then Hannibal invades Italy, and Taras decides now's our time to overthrow the Roman yoke. Of course, that ended how anybody knows the Second Punic War ended, and Taras gets sacked again and completely sold into slavery. But what's interesting about it as an example is that Rome attempts to do what it's done elsewhere first, and then when it meets resistance, hard resistance, a kind of a cultural breaking point, a watershed moment, it resorts to alternative methods. And this kind of back and forth, like seesaw effect of Roman diplomacy versus Roman hard power, hard versus soft power, is negotiated and constantly dynamic. And as a result, Romanization is not a good term for it, because removes all of the nuance. It removes all of the communication, all of the agency, all of the small differentiations between cultural identity that we can see either personally or communitively or collectively as a city-state or as a people, as a tribe, whatever it might be in respect to whatever interaction you're looking at. If you just think that Rome goes in, wants to change everything, wants to take over, and then they're Roman, you're losing so much in the process there. And so I will avoid that word like the plague. And I encourage people to consider that also, because you lose too much by just thinking that's how it works.
You use the term soft power, and I think maybe that's more apt for, the American sort of, I mean, obviously we're doing a little bit less of that and a little bit more of the hard power, unfortunately, recently. But Styles M talks about would it be more regionalization in the sense of Romans absorbing local regional culture? And that sort of brings to mind, saw recently a Catholic ritual or tradition. It was in South America that looks very foreign and sort of strange to Western Catholics because they don't understand that that's sort of a tradition that sort of was carried into or merged into a Catholic tradition. Is that sort of how it worked with the Roman Empire?
Well, which part of culture, I suppose, is the best way to think about it? Because if you say regionalization is probably not the term I would use, but I understand what you're getting at. I think regionalization is because a region, right? Let's say let's take Magna Graecia, right? Let's stay where we are, because then we can at least talk about it with the same names coming up rather than constantly bouncing around different places. And we're in Italy, so it's nice and Roman to the general audience. The region that the Greeks call Greater Greece, Magna Graecia, as we say in the anglicization of the Latin, is actually a hodgepodge of countless cultures: Lucanian, Sybarite, Roman, Latin, Etruscan, Greek, Tarentine, you name it, Pucetian, Daunian, you name all these peoples in this region, and suddenly that region is actually subdivided into a bunch of smaller self-identifying areas. So in order for it to be regionalization, you have to have a collective agreement, really, a cultural collective agreement. And if there isn't one there before Rome, then we're simply projecting the idea that there's one there after Rome. Because what's really likelihood, and this is something that I spend an awful lot of time on archaeologically, on digs that I direct and digs that I'm on every single year, is this how do we see it, right? And most of the time, we see it through death, through the funerary landscape, and through the construction of the funerary sphere. But what is that? That's probably, in all reality, that's probably more of a creation of the community than it is by the individual. Okay, there's a set of, you mentioned Christian ideology a couple of times. I'm not a non-expert in late antique Roman history, so the Christianization of the empire is not what I focus on. But Christianity across the world focuses on specific funerary motifs. When my mother died, for example, I even self-reflected at one moment and thought to myself, how much of this 3 days of funerary celebration is actually anything about my mother? How much of this is actually something we quote unquote have to do? And then where are the little moments in this ceremony where who she actually was and how everyone here remembered her actually shines through? And that same question can be applied to the ancient world, because we have to ask ourselves that about ceremony. We have to ask ourselves about how much of the individual are we actually seeing here? How much of the individual is being displayed, and how much say did the individual have in any of this? And therefore that begs the question, how much of this is this representative of any individual habit or practice? And how much of this is actually representative of a communal practice, or a regional practice even, or like a tribal or a local practice? So to answer your question, Styles, whether or not the Romans absorbed these or not, I don't think is a conscious decision. I think the Romans were very happy to let people live how they were living for the vast majority, as long as it didn't counteract with Roman values, which is something we get to in the later empire with Christians, where it does, and there's an awful lot of issues as a result of that. But I think the idea was that people still lived their lives whether or not Rome was running the region or not. An awful lot of that ground level evidence that we have for these periods of transition, an awful lot of it doesn't seem to change that much in comparison to the previous 2 centuries before and within about the next 2 centuries after. And when it does, it changes slowly. And it changes unless in the case of Taurus where complete populations are moved. This transitionary process is slow and it's almost methodical. And as a result, it's so cross-generational. It's probably not a directive from the Romans. It's probably just a result of hyperexposure, extended hyperexposure, and a change in the cultural dynamic of the region over time. So my long-winded answer to you is that regionalization insinuates a collective agreement, and I don't think there was. And as a result of there being no collective agreement, I don't think the Romans were choosing to absorb anything. I think they were just ambivalent to it, and it just changed by itself 90% of the time over long periods of time.
And you bring in the archaeology now. That's something else that obviously we want to talk about.
For sure.
The difference between what the history tells us, what's written down, what's recorded, and what archaeological evidence tells us. Is there something specific that you might think of that the archaeological evidence, things that we've dug up, has refuted, debunked, or altered sort of what we think of the history, the sort of what's written with, which obviously always has some sort of bias to it by whoever wrote it?
Yeah, absolutely, all the time, and long may it continue. History, when you say that, I presume you mean the primary historical sources. Is that what you mean? Like the history we get from the period, not scholarship later on it.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, all the time, because we have less than 0.1% of all the literature produced from the ancient world, right? And 90% of that 0.1% comes to us for various reasons that are motivated by political or social desires of the subsequent centuries. Okay, so whether or not texts from Strabo were replicated because of their potential utilization by geographers in the future, but how many geography related texts were lost to history because they determined that Strabo was the most important one? Same with Cicero's letters. Cicero's letters survive to us because Cicero is seen as this great orator. And he is, and he should be seen as that. But how many of Cato's addresses to the Senate and how many of Caesar's addresses to the Senate, who was known, all the other things that Caesar was known for, he was not known to be a great orator, okay? And it's frightening and fascinating at the same time how much we don't have when it comes to historical sources. And as a result, they will have a finite amount that survived 2,000 years. I believe even when we found the scrolls of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, we were surprised at how many sources we had duplicates of, which was quite surprising, considering we have this trash heap, which is an archaeologist's dream, and yet you're still finding some of the same scrolls that we already have records of. So it's we're hoping for something a little bit newer. And we did find additional things, but nothing that really reshaped our understanding of the historiography from the period, right? But archaeology doesn't have that finite amount in the same way, because archaeology preserves usually without the intention of the populations thereafter. Unless they've deliberately, removed it, like we've seen in the Middle East countless times. And you're making a statement there to remove cultural memory, and that's a whole other conversation. But archaeology ultimately is constantly reshaping how we see these things, because it's specifically doing it because it runs parallel to historiography. Very rarely does the archaeology and the historiography overlap to a point where one of them needs to change. What ends up happening is that they run parallel to each other, and they just slowly start to move closer together or further apart. That's more what happens, because the stuff that we find in funerary archaeology, for example, as I said, just to try and keep the same conversation going so people know what we're talking about, the stuff that you find in funerary archaeology is not probably going to change anything we know about Cicero, okay? But if Cicero has a comment to make about the Lucanians and how they lived, or the Latins in pre-Roman Latium, or the Etruscans, and suddenly we have funerary evidence that might actually point to or elaborate on how they're living, maybe that actually brings us closer. Maybe it validates what Cicero is talking about, or maybe it validates what Strabo is talking about, or maybe it moves us further away from it. It doesn't invalidate it necessarily, but it adds more to the conversation. And that's what archaeology does. Archaeology is constantly adding to the conversation. And it's not done with the intention to disprove or reaffirm any historiographical sources we have. It usually just works in tandem. It's a beautiful, as I've said before, I've used the word for the Roman Empire, but it's a beautiful symbiosis. And they work together 95% of the time. As a matter of fact, I was watching a video with the community recently about how historiography, volcanology, seismology, and all of these different things, and paleobotany and osteoarchaeology and everything has kind of all come together in a beautiful symbiosis around Pompeii to potentially show us that Pompeii mightn't have actually happened in August. It might have happened in September or October of that year rather than August. And even though Pliny says August 24th, it's actually potentially a mistake of the translator over the last 2,000 years. And that's an interesting point of view, one that has made its way onto YouTube channels and stuff ever since we watched it on my stream, because it was a YouTube video and it's a very accessible one that you can find online. But that's an interesting little tidbit that you can look to kind of be like, well, it doesn't mean that Pliny's wrong about everything he writes about. It means that maybe something happened in the whisper period in between. But what matters is that all of the science, all of the efforts of hardworking scientists and people who care are elaborating on the source and potentially bringing alternatives to the field. And that's how the two live together. They live next door to each other, and sometimes they visit.
So another great answer that brings up more questions, which is, how it works in things which, we don't know everything about.
Sure.
Speaking of the archaeology, the outskirts of the Roman Empire, or the Roman period, the Republic period, is something that's always interested me, of how outside regions, nations, peoples saw from the outside in the Roman period, and sort of archaeological finds that people find of like, oh, in China they found these Roman coins. Did they actually get that far? What did people think of the Roman Empire from the outside looking in?
Well, it's a big question. You live next door and sometimes you visit. It's such a badass. I'm glad you like it. How do I approach this in a way that kind of gives a satisfactory answer without it being a generalization? Because that's something I want to try and avoid.
It is a big thing, and you can pick any period or,
Okay. If you take Rome at its most expansive, right? Let's call it that. So let's take Rome between... they often talk about Rome between the Punic Wars. Okay, so between kind of the 260s and 200 BCE. Okay, so that kind of 60 years, Rome makes massive leaps geographically. Okay, it has beaten Carthage. It has encroached on Illyria and Macedonia. It's established itself in Asia Minor. It's established itself in the Near East. It has a very slowly becoming more one-sided relationship with Ptolemaic Egypt. Its relationship with Carthage is not good, but Rome has the upper hand. It's expanding across southern Gaul, southern modern-day France, and is expanding into northeastern Spain down to where Carthage holds in Spain, and it kind of bumps up against each other there. In that period, okay, I think it would be fair to establish an understanding that the historiography is often Roman, okay? Not always, but often. And as a result, it's extremely biased. And the Romans love to talk about how they think they're seen, okay? That is an extremely difficult thing to disprove archaeologically, or prove, because archaeology does not show opinion. Archaeology shows fact, right? Is it there? Is it not? What does it mean? If you're trying to get at opinion in that period when Rome is hyper expanding, you're trying to grasp at surviving literary accounts from largely non-surviving literate nations, such as, like, we have surviving inscriptions from southern Spain. We have some inscriptions from the Po Valley and from the far side, northern side of the Alps, and we have some from Illyria and Macedonia. But really, the opinion you're getting is from the major powers. You're getting it from Carthage, you're getting it from Greece, you're getting it from Macedonia, and I'm saying Greece as a collective. But obviously, to put the kind of asterisk on that, Greece is not a unified entity in any shape or form. It's city-states still, and there's some leagues, but it's still city-states. And you're getting it from Egypt. And I think their opinion of Rome, particularly when you look at Macedonia and Hellas, when you look at Greece, their opinion on Rome changes depending on who they're interacting with from Rome. Okay, so like Aemilius Paulus in Greece garners some pretty mixed opinions from the Greek populations and the Macedonian populations at the time, based on his military exploits and his famous speeches given and his monuments around. And this is often talked about in kind of like it's a reality we have to deal with. When you look at Philip V and how he interacts with Rome when Rome is on the back foot against Hannibal, it's a lot more confident, and it's a lot more, well, there's no Romans here to stop us. There's no one that I have to interact with because they're all caught up with Hannibal in southern Italy. So they become a lot more kind of negative in their viewpoint. So I think there's kind of a two-part answer to your question. One, the people that you're interested about are the same people I'm interested about, which are the indigenous peoples and the smaller tribes and local peoples that are not large, kind of what you would call almost like an ancient superpower. And we just don't have it. We just don't see it. Not in enough of a quantity to make a generalized opinion on how they saw Rome. And that's just a reality, unfortunately. And in archaeology, you can't search for that. It's too specific. You kind of have to dig and see what it gives you. And then after that, you analyze whether or not it has anything to do with the question you wanted to answer. And often it doesn't. But it doesn't mean that the thing it's given you isn't beautiful and worth exploring. On the flip side, the opinions that we do see come to us are extremely changeable and are dependent on socioeconomic and sociopolitical circumstances that are honestly not representative of a general viewpoint. And that is something that I think we have to be careful with, because you can't assume that the top 1% is in any way actually truly representative of the bottom 99% when it comes to the opinion of who they're either allied or at war with, in this case Rome, because it's really not representative at all. It changes on a whim. So I'm giving you kind of a nothing answer there, but I've tried to be as detailed as I can in doing so, because it's just not something we can really get at deliberately often.
Well, it's a mirror of the situation. So, I mean, we learn a lot from the answer, even if it's not the exact answer we were looking for. So we talked about the outside in. What about the inside then? You said the Romans were interested in what they felt other people's thought about them, which again brings to mind how Americans feel, how Americans think. How do other countries see us, but we see it through our lens. What about the Romans themselves in that sort of period that you are most interested in, across the how it changes across that social strata of, the common Roman citizen, how they feel about Rome. Do they feel like Americans do, where, we're the best, we're the greatest, and, they have that sort of feeling.
I'll just put out there, just as I understand it's a common thing to do, and I'm not criticizing in any way. I'm just kind of putting it out there because I think it's a fair opinion. I would also be careful about 2,000-year cross comparisons in any way, even if they seem applicable. I think it's something I would. I'm not saying this specifically to you. I'm saying it to everybody. That like cross millennia comparisons are. I would honestly use the word dangerous. And I stand by that, because we cannot fathom, and I'm not being exaggerative here, I'm not being hyperbolic, we cannot fathom the difference in cultural mindset. Okay. For example, just taking something like slavery. Okay. The Romans didn't even consider it something worth talking about as potentially wrong, right? That mindset is phenomenally different even to the 19th century in the Americas and Europe. Okay, the leaps and bounds that have to happen in 1800 years to even get to the point where somebody goes, maybe we shouldn't be doing this, is such a leap in mentality that if that, as something so obviously wrong, is something that is so ingrained within the social psyche, we really cannot make the comparison over 2,000 years that they saw anything in the same way that we see it today. So when you talk about like, and I mean plurally, not you, but like when you talk about pride or like seeing Rome as some sort of collective entity, even Hollywood depicts it as like, for the glory of Rome, of this like some sort of unified thing. Realistically, that's again a representation of the top 1 or 5%. Okay, what you do get is individual pride, and I think the HBO series Rome that we mentioned in chat a while ago actually captures that beautifully, because Pullo and Varenus have an allegiance to the 13th lead. 13, they scream it. That is closer to what it actually is. Pride aligns with immediate vicinity in the ancient world. They do not have the voice or the accessibility to be heard in the same way that we do today. And so as a result, collective identity is actually something that is very hard to actually grasp at. If you're talking about collective identity, it often stops at your lived community. And then there's a larger identity between various lived communities and the city-state or place they live in. So basically what I'm saying is that if you were to find a Roman citizen in North Africa, okay, and you were to ask a Roman citizen in Britain if they both have pride for Rome, they probably will both tell you no, realistically, because they see themselves as part of the Roman ecosystem and they have Roman citizenship. But whether or not there's some undying connection or pride to the central entity that is Rome, she quote unquote stands for, that Hollywood likes to shove down our throats, it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. If you've never been there, why would you care about it? All you care about is that you pay taxes and you have rights because you're part of a political ecosystem. So when you're in North Africa and you're living within your community in a place that your ancestors have lived for X amount of 100 generations, and nothing has changed about your life other than maybe your name and how you pay your taxes and to whom, you're not going to have some sort of undying pride that we would see as today having like a national pride. That's very central to the city of Rome and its hinterland and the population that's transient through it. Everything else is kind of more of a practicality and your lived reality. And I think that that's also got to do with the fact of the spread of information and the fact that we, in a modern sense, in the modern world, all the way back until, the early 1800s, our mass media, in whatever way, from the printing press onwards, has allowed for unified collective information drops and also unified collective thought. And that's really not something that you can say existed between North Africa and Britain during the Roman period. So why, if the cultural gap is 2 millennia, would we assume, if they don't think the same way as us practically, why would they have any relationship to each other than something that extends socioeconomically? So I don't put a lot of stock in that idea of this kind of, we are Rome, 55 million people strong. I just don't think there's any evidence for that unified ideology above the 1% of the patrician class who are able to be transient around the empire to that degree.
Yeah, so that's makes it seem like there's just this disparate sort of change, or how they view the change in management, I guess. And you talked earlier about how the Romans didn't force things to change in people's culture. They let them do whatever they were going to do as long as they pay their taxes and don't, rock the boat, so to speak. And that's sort of the reason, you would say, that they don't have this sort of pride in Rome. They're still themselves. There's just this different sort of structure.
Yes, which is why I put such a lot of people talk about this like Edward Gibbon theory that, the fall of Rome, like it's one of the greatest coffee table topics ever, in every book club, in every seminar series, in everything you've ever talked about ever. It's like, why did Rome fall? How did Rome fall? When did it start? When was the beginning of the end? Was it when Caesar was killed, or was it all the way back to when Tarquinius Superbus was murdered and the Republic? Should they have stayed a monarchy and a city-state? Like, Gibbon, one of the suggested thoughts is that they lead poisoning. Like, come on, and it's just, but of all the things, right, you can't escape it. You can't escape the idea of like, well, what caused it? What is it? What is this elusive thing that led Rome to fall? To be honest with you, it's probably Rome's fault. More so than barbarian invasion and all of these. It's a collective 1 million tiny issues. And what matters there is that when Rome has this sense of like where it fits within the larger world, at any point in its republic or empire, it's constantly negotiated. And my tuppence worth, my opinion on it, and everyone can call me wrong because I'm there talking about what caused the Roman Empire to collapse, but I think one of the least talked about moments in the Roman imperial, let's call it event calendar, is the universal citizenship granted by Caracalla in 211. Right? That is a huge moment. Is 211 or 213? One of the other. Someone will tell me. Is a huge moment in a shift in the Roman political and social ecosystem. Because suddenly, you don't have to work for it. Suddenly, something which has been just out of reach, like our baker friend in Rome, who managed to rise up the social ladder, and be wealthy enough to afford a tomb. 212. I was in the middle. Apologies. Thank you. I said 211 or 213. It's 212. Close enough. Is that represents something. That progression is the pride you're looking for when you talk about Roman pride. Roman pride is not pride in the city of Rome. It's pride in what you can do as a part of Rome. And that's a very modern concept of it's very John F. Kennedy. It's like, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's got reminiscence of that. But as soon as everything becomes available, as soon as citizenship is not something that auxiliaries have to work for, it's not something that people have to try and work into, I think that at that moment everything changes, right? And the reason that I bring it up is because you asked me a question about, Rome maintaining the status quo, Rome, and I brought up about Rome negotiating its place. The reason that Rome, over all its centuries, survives is because of two reasons. One is obviously its military prowess. No one can deny it. It's often overstated, but it's still an undeniable reason. And the other is the attraction of Rome. Okay? That other we do not talk enough about how much other city-states, peoples wanted to be with the cool kids a lot of the time. And I say that playfully, because that's kind of how it feels sometimes, you know? We see the border of Rome often drawn in this, you know, thick red blob that stops at the Rhine and the Danube, and sometimes extends beyond into Asia Minor and down to Persia, and, you know, a little bit into the Sahara. We see it like it's one of the most famous empire pictures ever, alongside Alexander's extent over to, you know, India, or the British Empire maybe, and all the, you know, all the places that get colored red there as well. But what we don't see is the chora, okay? The Greek word chora, the hinterland, right? The part that Rome interacts with actively beyond that red line that gets so often drawn on the map. We know for a fact that there's Roman interaction and goods found miles into Germania, miles into the Elbe River and beyond. We know that there's Roman goods. I've seen it myself. I've seen the goods that have been found in Ireland, right? Which is never colored red. We know that there's sub-Saharan trade that goes all the way across the Sahara Desert and down into Central Africa. We know that there's consistent trade with India. We have archaeological evidence of trade happening of ivory tusks and hippopotamus tusks and obviously elephants, hippos, everything that comes, spices from India, in such quantities that they have to be regular trades. They're actively, there's jobs for middlemen to transport the goods from the merchant to the buyer across from India to Egypt, and they have records of tax collection based on the goods that get charged back to the merchant. We have it. We have the whole ecosystem. It survives. And this whole ecosystem that extends beyond that red blob, that's actually the benefit of Rome. That's what is the attraction. It's kind of like a magnet. And there's been many articles done about the magnetism of cities, about demography and demographic pull, and about network fulcrums, and the idea that transient populations across routes are magnetized basically by the allure of the city. And this is something which Rome takes. It's a phenomenon that exists in the Greek world with polis and city-states, polis and chora. But Rome takes it and puts it on steroids, and it becomes this hyper attraction. And as soon as that gets watered down to being everybody inside the line is a citizen, everybody outside the line is not, I think Rome loses a part of that potential negotiation. And as a result, it loses a part of its allure. And then it starts to potentially take other turns. And so that negotiation that Rome has is constantly adjusting and renewing that negotiation with people at every single level, intentionally or otherwise, is the lifeblood of the empire. And it doesn't even just exist within its borders. It actively, and honestly, probably to an extent that we will never fully understand, extends beyond its borders to an extent that I think would blow our minds. And that's just my professional kind of educated guess on that. I think we do not know the scope, and I think it would blow our minds, the scope of that connection outside of Rome's borders.
That seems a whole lot more interesting to me than that, a red line, that there's this gradient outside of the influence, where in this period, in this area, Rome has this incredible influence that you want to be a part of, and there's probably a sense of security, safety in that there's this powerful entity that is able to provide great trade opportunities, networking, I think you used, and that scope sort of brings me back to, they find coins in China. People are saying in the chat they found coins in Finland and Japan brought by Indian and Dutch traders. Monsignor Roads, the Roman roads.
If I may as well,
yes, please.
Crossed my mind. Romans, I don't know if anyone in chat knows this, but the name for that red line that we so regularly draw on the map, the Latin name for it is limes. It's where we get the word limit from. Limes, spelled the same as limes, right? A lime is totally different. Again, like the tyranny conversation, like it's totally different than what we think is like a frontier. And Hollywood loves to shove this down our throat as well. It's like, oh, I crossed the Roman frontier. The first thing you think of when you think about the edge of the Roman world is probably Hadrian's Wall. I would bet 90% of people in this chat, if they had to think about it, would just immediately go to Hadrian's Wall, right? Because it's become mythologized. It also nearly basically forms the border between England and Scotland anyway. Not quite, but close enough. And it's a hard, physical, like it's almost picturesque, right? Border. But the Roman limes doesn't mean that. The Hadrian's Wall is an outlier, right? A limes is transient. A lime is negotiated. It's constantly, the Antonine Wall. Shout out the Antonine Wall, which doesn't get any love. A palisade wall north of Hadrian's Wall, and it just gets completely overlooked. Absolutely styles. Sorry, my digression there. But these limes are negotiated constantly. They're transient borders. They're not a hard, like a Berlin Wall-esque thing where you have to pass a checkpoint to get in. They're constantly negotiated. In fact, it's so transient that Augustus's idea for the limit of the empire was supposed to be natural limits, things that were naturally hard to cross, rather than constructed limits. He wanted the limits of the empire to be the Elbe and the Danube, the Parthian Empire and the Sahara Desert and the ocean, right? Obviously, Teutoburg Forest, 9 AD, Varus, give me back my legions. I'm sure everybody knows that. Didn't happen, and it turned out to be the Rhine, because the distance between the Elbe and the Danube is smaller than the distance between the Rhine and the Danube, so it's easier to defend. But absolutely, Monsignor. I want to hear how you said that. But this limit is established on a natural boundary because it reduces the potential population flow over it that you can kind of contain a little bit, or at least mediate in some way. But that's because the Roman limes are supposed to be constantly transient, constantly negotiated, and constantly a part of this. They're fluid. It's not like a 1 minute you're in Rome and 1 minute you're not. Like if you jumped across a time zone, it doesn't work that way. And so that line that gets drawn on the map constantly is a little bit, and I would never wish for it to stop, because I think it's important to have a clarity of communication at some point. And it is clear communication, and it's not incorrect. But I think it just, as I said at the very start of this lecture, it's just a little bit more complicated than that,
The way you worded it makes me think of how, and again, it's our modern perspective, but the way in movies where you cross the border from the United States into Mexico and there's this yellow filter. Every movie set in Mexico has this yellow filter. It's like, oh, now I'm no longer in America. I'm in a different place. This is a foreign land. And it's not like that in reality, especially in, a period where we don't have these hard border lines and border checkpoints between places.
And by the way, just to clarify that point, sorry, when you make the comparison, I fully acknowledge, as an educator myself, it's my job, okay? I know that we need to lean on simplistic, relatable, communicative examples, okay? And often the easiest way to do that is to bring it into our lived experience. That's good pedagogy. That's good teaching, to give somebody something they relate to so that they can understand the more complicated part of it, right? But just for those of us who are making cross-millennia comparisons in order to make a larger point, then the simplistic communication is not enough to justify kind of elaborate conclusion, if that makes sense. You have to
Yeah.
balance the communicative aspect with the conclusion that you come to, and there has to be a journey in between there. So I fully acknowledge and support and think it's that people use examples to understand the starting point, but it just can't also be where you end up. That's it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Am I being clear?
Yeah. I'm trying to learn piano to help with my dexterity, and you have to learn the basics before you can, the things that you learn at the first stages of learning an instrument are, that's not where you end. It becomes much more complex and nuanced, and you learn music theory and all that, and maybe I'll never get there, but the pursuit of that is important.
I think that there's a spectrum to it, and if you have an accessible starting point like the map, the big red blob, that's great. Sure, what you're talking about now. Great, let's go from there.
Yeah, we want to get people away from thinking you cross the border into Mexico and the sky becomes yellow.
Sure. Yeah, but also it's important to know that, like, that at some point when you cross from Germania into, let's say you make it into Central Gaul, at some point it does start to look a bit more Roman. Maybe you start to walk on a paved road and places start to have foras in it, and you're like, okay, I'm not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, well, that piece of the puzzle in perceiving it brings me to your live streaming and your, how you balance that, getting across things in a way that is accessible, the accessibility of the information to an audience that you don't necessarily know who's going to be there. It could be a random person who shows up and doesn't have all the context and is, doesn't have this broader, nuanced perspective. How you balance that, being accessible to bring new people in, and being very historically accurate as a historian, as an archaeologist.
There's three things that you need to be able to do, and I don't even know if I do them well. I just know them, and so therefore, hopefully, awareness leads me to be a little bit better at them than if I didn't know what I was doing. 1, you got to be patient enough to repeat yourself. 2, you got to be patient enough to expect the silly question, because there's no such thing as a silly question. Even if you've answered it 15 times, it's not a silly question. And then the third thing, which I stand by in both IRL teaching and communicating on stream, is that you have to approach it from the point of view that this person doesn't know anything. Sounds so pejorative. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this person is not aware of all the facts, right? And you have to be the best first impression for their introduction to it. If you can't hear the same thing said 10 times, be okay with answering it 10 times and making sure all 10 times are said with the same love and enthusiasm for the subject. Any one of those things will ruin the experience for a new person. They're the 3 things I live by. I have to say it every single time like it's the first time I'm saying it, and like as if I have to sell it to somebody who I think would love it if they just sat down and listened a bit more.
Very good points to remember for myself, for anyone who is watching who does educational streaming. And by the way, if you do, check out the Knowledge Fellowship Discord, jump in there and network, learn a little bit more about the other educators and support each other. So I think we should change gears just a little bit, because now we're talking a little bit more about you and your live streaming.
Yeah.
How did you get to this point where you're doing it? What made you first start deciding to live stream? But even before that, why did you decide to get into history and become a historian and start getting into archaeology?
Oh wow, okay. I should answer the second one first, because the second one leads to the why I got into live streaming. So I'll go reverse order. I feel like as if I don't know if any of you watch an Idol or X Factor, but when you come on with, like, when the contestant comes on and the dramatic music plays and they kind of have like the sob story, and you're like, oh yeah, they're getting through. No matter how good they sing, they're through to the next round. So cue the dramatic music. But my grandfather was in the Irish Coast Guard, basically, and he worked alongside. Because at that point, the Irish Lights is what it's called. They used to go around service lighthouses across Britain and Ireland. They were still intrinsically linked with the British Navy at the same time, even though we were not at that point in any way connected with Britain, like we were a republic. But for practical reasons and for diplomatic reasons, we had to be part of kind of the same thing. And as a result, following the Second World War, my grandfather had a bunch of men, including even Native Americans, on his boat that had stayed in the UK after the Second World War and were working with him and changing boats and working on the lighthouses. He got exposed to so many people and cultures. And when I was growing up, my mother used to always say to me, because I used to go to my grandparents, run into my grandfather's room, and I would sit with him for hours, and all my aunties and uncles, he would just dominate the conversation. Like, I found out later as an adult what he would do. He would just love to talk and talk and talk. No one would get a word. And at one stage, my uncle turned around to my mum and was like, "What are you paying Steve to go in and talk to Grandad like that?" I was fascinated. I would run into him and sit with him. I'm no exaggeration, for like 3 hours, and he would just talk, right? And I loved it. I loved him telling me about the Second World War. I loved him telling me about everybody he met, and I was just fascinated with it. And I remember, of course, like every kid, you just start emulating. So I was like, oh, I'm just going to read all Grandad's books on the Second World War. And I remember the moment it switched, because I was like, cool army. Ooh, the Romans have a cool army, and my favorite color is red. Same reason I picked the Chicago Bulls as my basketball team. I was like, I'm just going to read about the Romans. When I tell you, it all changed at about 11 years of age when I started to stop reading about the army and started reading about the people. Started reading about like Cicero and started reading about like Cato and Scipio Africanus. I stopped caring about how many people died and started caring about what decisions were made. And it just changed my whole perspective. And then as I started to go through school, I always knew what I wanted to do. I always knew I wanted to do something history. In fact, I want to be like Ross from Friends. I want to be a paleontologist, but there's no dinosaur programs in Ireland. And it's absolutely atrocious. And I think that there should be, because maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation. And I'd be on with Danny from Paleontologizing.
Yes.
But instead, I ended up going into history, and I went through my secondary education. I took classics as like my school didn't do it, so I took it online, and then I sat the exam and everything. And then I went into my uni and I did art history and archaeology as my undergrad, ancient history, archaeology, and history of art and architecture. And then from then I did my master's in Italy, in Rome, and now I'm doing my PhD here in Toronto in Canada. And in the meantime there, I have done, my God, it's like 6 or coming on 7 years of archaeology professionally, which is insane, because it feels like only like last year. And I think I've met more talented archaeologists who've never studied a degree in it than I have people digging with a PhD. And I will put my hand on my heart and say that. And I think that is the most beautiful aspect of archaeology, because you don't need anything to get into it. You just need to know where to look. And I will help. I have helped dozens of people get involved in community digs and research digs and professional digs. I've written recommendation letters. I've invited people on the digs that I supervise and direct across Europe. And it is so accessible. And maybe it's not for everybody. Maybe you spend one season swinging a shovel and you go, oh God, no, not for me. Not for me. I'm going to be an osteo and I'm going to go into the lab and study animal bones. And that's cool. You found it out. That's amazing. That's so beautiful in its own right. And then I did a lot of archive work as well for the government in Ireland. I worked on UNESCO World Heritage sites. And slowly but surely, I just went from being that kid in my granddad's room to where I am now, which is like directing excavations and publishing on them and teaching people about them. And I honestly think if I if I was able to go back and do anything, I don't think I would go back and talk to younger me. I think I would go back now at 28 to my granddad's room and tell him where I am now, and I would kill to see his reaction. And that's really my intro into history and where I am now. And during COVID, I couldn't do an awful lot of it, and I love playing games, so I decided to play history games on stream and see maybe if I could talk to some people about history. And I'm still doing it 5 years later. And I'm not trying to be Jacksepticeye here as another Irish content creator, but if just a dozen people, or maybe over the 5 years, maybe a dozen a year, come in and out of the stream and go, I actually did that college course for a year, or I went and looked at that dig because I thought you needed a degree to do it, but you don't, but I actually went and I inquired about it and I ended up doing it, and Steve, it was because you like told me to do it, or like encouraged me to do it. I'm like, that's the biggest win I'll ever get from streaming. I don't need 4 million views on a YouTube video. I just need 4 people to come to me over 5 years and say, I actually did it, I dug, and I loved it. I'm like, that's good enough. That's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel it absolutely does. And I feel the same way in live streaming versus, produced video content, in that there's so much more connection that you can make with people in a live stream where you can talk to them, where they can talk to you. And it's not just reading comments and maybe doing a reply to the comments. You're able to really interact. It's much more like a classroom, but it's so much more relaxed, and people can, come as they are, so to speak. And that's something that has appealed to me in terms of why I live stream health content. It's, I can talk to people rather than just lecturing at them.
Yeah, 100%. I love it too. I think it's so great. And I think that I don't know if it's the same with you, but there's such a gate kept, or like a stigma around archaeology. They're like, oh, I've never. And people, the amount of people who come to me, even in classes that I teach with archaeology students, who come to me and go, is there any way to like get on a dig, or like do I have to wait until I'm done my degree? I'm like, no, you can come, email me tonight. Like, it's so accessible. It's so ready for you to be a part of it. You can contribute to active living history. You can do it. And it is so easy to do. And sometimes it's just buried. Oh, pun intended.
There you go.
There we go.
There you go. It's buried.
Sometimes it's just buried beneath a bunch of what seem like barriers, but they're not. They're actually really not. And often a lot of professional and research companies are crying out for people to be involved with them. And you do not need, I reiterate what I said, some of the best archaeologists I've ever dug with have never sat in a classroom labeled archaeology, ever. And they are some of the best excavators and best eyes and most to the minutia exquisite professionals I've ever seen. And some of the worst are professors. And some of the worst are doctors. And I know I'm doing a PhD. I don't want to be one of them. I want to be one of the good ones, but it is completely arbitrary. Somebody asked there, I have like 3 questions. Do you mind if I answer one?
Yes, please. We'll get to some questions.
My favorite dig is one of the most recent ones I did. Oh God, maybe it's not. Okay, I have 2. I've one in an honorable mention. I won't tell you which order they're in. One of the most recent ones I did, I found a statue, which I can't talk about very much because I'm waiting on the article to be peer reviewed. Then I can talk about it. But I found a statue, which is a big deal for where we found it, which is really cool. And I actually found it, which was even cooler, because technically if you're like running the dig, like found it, but somebody else on the dig did, but for like publishing purposes it's like your discovery, but actually this time I swung the pickaxe and hit it, and I was like, oh, fantastic. So that was a cool moment for something that big. It was immediately taken away to a museum, which is actually really cool. But the other honorable mention is actually an excavation I was on in Ireland, where I was working on a contract job, and I found it by accident, and the director hated me for it. because the previous testing had shown that it was a large, heavily magnetized area, which is probably a Fullachthia, if anyone knows what that is. It's where they used to like boil water and meat and potentially bathed and stuff. Nightmare to dig, absolute nightmare, because it's just sludge, right? And the director on the first day of site, because I arrived late because I was doing testing down the country, I showed up and he was like, okay, start cleaning back and whatever. So I was doing my job, and I saw like there was this perfect like rectangle. I was like, oh, that's weird. I kept on cleaning back and there was another perfect rectangle. I was like, oh, I was like, no. And I turned around to him and I went, can I go down a little bit? And he was like, yeah. He said, what do you think you have? And I went, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to give you if I'm right, so I hope I'm wrong. I wasn't wrong, and it was 111 graves.
Wow.
Triple stacked.
Wow.
In a place, and it had shown up as a reading of high magnetism. So we had budgeted the dig to be 12 weeks. It did not take 12 weeks. It was, I think the final tally was 107 skeletons with about another 27 DSKs, we call them, which are disarticulated skeletons. It was incredible bioarc. It was insane. And because I had excavated human remains before, I, along with the osteo, was training people on how to do it. The osteo was looking at how I did it, was okay with it, and then allowed me to kind of go and like help, because there was just too many people who didn't know how to do it, so we had to split the workload a bit. And then everybody got up to a standard where we would excavate down to a certain point, and then the osteo would come in and record it, and it was just this arduous process, but it was incredible. It was absolutely, I'd never be on a dig like it again, I don't think. It was absolutely insane. Definitely not accidentally, and stuff does come up accidentally, but that was incredible. My favorite history related game, Rome 2 Total War, will always get an honor mention there. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is brilliant. I mean, do you know what was a great game? It was The Forgotten City. If anyone's ever played it, about you go to the afterlife as a Roman. And do you know what I loved about it? They got the Latin perfect in it. Just like the show on Netflix, Barbarians, got the Latin. They actually were able to do formal and colloquial Latin in the show. And it was absolutely phenomenal. It was beautiful to listen to. And I was like, that's a game that knows its stuff. It wasn't perfect in everything it did. It was still a game. But my God, it was able to do both styles of Latin. And I was like, wow, somebody knows their stuff there. And then if people want to be involved in their first dig, what piece of advice would you give them to get the most out of it? Buy your own trowel. Buy your own trowel, and not a plastic handled garden trowel. Buy a wooden handled short 6-inch trowel. Your arms will thank you. Your hand and your wrist will thank you. I promise you. Okay. Other than that, be okay with being tired. You're going to be tired. That's okay. Love it anyway. And you're going to be wet or scorchingly hot. It's usually only one or the other. You never get like good weather in archaeology. You get great weather or horrendous weather. That's just how it works. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules.
Embrace the suck. Absolutely. That's something my drill sergeants told me all the time. I want to say to viewers and anyone who's considering doing any kind of citizen science, if you watch CosmoQuest, aka Star Strider, she's always talking about you can do citizen science. You don't need to have, as you've been pointing out, you don't necessarily need to have formal education to contribute. If you want to be an educational streamer, you don't necessarily need to have formal education. If you have a special interest, if you have, if you've got personal knowledge, you can be educational. You can stream things that are going to help enrich people. You can learn from your viewers as well. That's also important. It's a two-way street, and you always learn when you teach. It's the rubber duck phenomenon.
Your only responsibility, if you choose to be an educational anything, is your responsibility is to not misinform. That's it.
Yes.
You can learn as you go, and it's totally okay with saying, I don't know. In fact, saying it makes people believe what you do say even more.
I don't know is the beginning of wisdom, is it not? Like, you have to know what you don't know before you can know what to look into, know what to think about.
Couldn't agree more.
So one thing I did want to also talk about, you talked about your grandfather and that being a big influence. I had something similar. I didn't go into it. My great grandmother was the last native speaker of her indigenous American language. So there were always people around the house trying to talk to her, listen to her, get the pronunciation right, because she was the last person who had spoken it as her, her mother tongue. And making me think about indigenous American history is there's always been controversy in archaeology of ownership of artifacts and giving them to who they belong to. It must be more difficult or less of a controversy perhaps when you're talking about things that are from periods that have long passed. Has that ever come up though for you with what's the word?
I don't know if it's much of a thing. Have you ever heard of a thing, Parthenon marbles? They're long past, and there's a whole question about whether or not they should. But we won't get into that here. But no, we don't call them that. The Parthenon marble. No, I'm joking. They are technically. Yeah, I'm being pedantic. I'm just. No, you're right. Has it ever come up with me personally? Yes. I've witnessed it. I have not. It has not been me involved, if that makes sense. Is that an okay degree of separation?
For sure, yeah.
I have witnessed it before. I don't know how much I can say about it. I can give you general comments. I'm genuinely not sure how much I can actually talk about it. What I would say is that it concerned remains of a human being, and there was a question over the dating and over the potential ancestry and how close they were to the living population. And don't worry, I have also, if anyone thinks that this is talking about like in the last like 3 years or something, I've also had that I can talk about. When you think you've found remains and they're in the wrong stratigraphic layer and you have to call the police, that has also happened. Wow. I've also found munitions on site. That has also happened. But those two things are not what I'm talking about. Where the exciting might not be the word I use, but sure. Terrifying, unnerving. Yeah, sure. No, I know what you mean. Study, I'm only joking. But absolutely, yeah, the heart rate went up. My Samsung watch definitely didn't like me that day. It thought it said, "Do you need to call 911?" It's like, don't worry, I'll be on it for a different reason. But no, the one that I witnessed was in relation to a potential burial on a farmland, which had a bit of question over whether or not there was a potential relationship there between the current owner and the remains found, and that he was just unaware of it. And I think that's the only thing I can say about it, because I just feel like as if it's a little bit of invasion of privacy beyond that.
Yeah.
But I witnessed that, and I'm not even 100% sure what the conclusion was, because we were told to just move on elsewhere on site. And that all just happened in the background. I'm sure for legal reasons. There's a reason I don't know an awful lot of the details of it. But that definitely brought up an awful lot of questions of... I don't want to use the word like ownership. It feels like the wrong phrase to use, but like connection, proximity of connection to what was being found. And here in Canada, that's a huge thing, massive, and rightly so, because of the indigenous populations, even around here in Toronto, like the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and all of these still living populations have active representation on heritage boards and active participation in archaeological excavations. They have oversight committees. They have people who come out and like an overseer who comes out onto the excavation to make sure that things are happening in accordance with the agreed upon laws and bylaws. And I think that's so important, because in Ireland, it's a little bit different because we don't have that indigenous population. It comes down to more like, as I witnessed, like, and in Europe it's kind of the same thing. It comes down to personal connection and the potential connection there. But when it comes to Canada and the US probably as well, I've never dug in the US, but that constant presence of the living indigenous community is something that gets talked about an awful lot in my archaeological circles as being both incredibly central and important, and also an incredibly like actively negotiated thing, site by site. It can't just be ruled upon by one sentence in a law. It has to be actively, every single site you come across, there's a negotiation that happens, as it should be.
Yeah. Provenance, is that the word that might work? Whose provenance?
Yeah.
Of a site, of an item, a relic.
I think you'd be right. Yeah. Usually,
I was trying to think about that.
Yeah, you would be correct. I think often in classical archaeology, provenance is if we even have an idea of where it comes from. If a pottery sherd has provenance in any way, it'll place it in its original context, or has it been grave robbed, for example, and it's just ended up on the black market, then it's provenance. I think it's a far more important and culturally weighted term in the Americas potentially than in Europe. Although I was on a dig where in Spain, where two village communities shared a burial ground, and there was a part of the active negotiation, because technically it was not against any laws for the archaeological excavation to take place near it, but depending on which side we were digging on, the other village would come and bring us snacks and wine. The other one would come to us on the other day when we were on the kind of like, oh, you're not on our side today, and there's this like living connection with the community, and they were very like that was something that was a little bit more unusual at the time, because there was a lot of questions over whether or not who was kind of the original town in the place, but it was a little bit more kind of geopolitical rather than like who's the first town here, rather than necessarily has the same cultural weight and potential issues that come up with indigenous archaeology. They made it more of like a almost, I don't want to say like playful, but they made it a bit more like we can get one up on our village neighbor, depending on what you find, which I think is a little bit more a little bit lower stakes than some of the indigenous archaeology I've come across here in Canada. So yeah.
Dapper Historian asks, is there a viable path to go from hobbyist grave robber to legitimate archaeologist? What do you think, that Lara Croft is a hobbyist grave robber, or is she a legitimate archaeologist? That's, I guess, the question that comes to mind then.
I mean, I can ask the same question about Indiana.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there a viable path? I think I don't know how to answer.
Money is probably the difference. If you're rich enough like Lara Croft, you can probably get away with doing that. But I don't necessarily think you can just start grave robbing as a hobby and then make that transition.
Actually, I can bring this on to actually something that is a serious topic for 2 minutes, if you like.
Sure, yes.
Metal detecting. Metal detecting is a hobby in the UK. It's something you're allowed to do. There's nuance to it, I believe, but in Ireland it's completely forbidden, and in Italy it's also completely forbidden, and Greece have strict laws about it as well. And I think there actually lies a potential comparison where somebody who actively searches for pieces of history themselves when it's legal to do so, maybe they're not a grave robber but they're a hobbyist, I'm taking the first word, and then decides, actually I'd like to be a part of this more officially and maybe be paid for it, or actively do it on a seasonal basis. I think there is a path there potentially, but if the metal detecting is illegal in the first place, then maybe that's just called getting on the right path in life.
Yeah. And you're going from a black hat hacker to maybe white hat hacker.
Yeah, where you start setting up the programs and software for companies to prevent them from being hacked. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. You learn a lot about the negative way to do things, so that you can do it the right way.
Yeah. Greece goes overboard demanding the state get all the fines. Monsignor's not incorrect. It's usually the Ephoria in Greece that decides where the fines go, depending on the proximity to local museums and archival facilities, which technically is part of the state, so you're not wrong. But there's also this kind of there's like a little bit of a nuance to it where it still can stay within the community. And like, for example, there's a museum called the Museum of the Messara in Crete, which takes all the finds from like Aya Nikolaos and Knossos and Komos and all of these sites around that area, in that regional area called the Messara, and it basically just kind of like becomes the hub in the center. So yeah, you're right, but at the same time, it's like at least they're trying to keep it close to where it can be seen, to where it was found, you know. The UK is all about keeping whatever you find for yourself. Yeah, that was a huge problem in Ireland when a metal detectorist found a Roman hoard.
And just in general about UK historically, it's about keeping whatever you find. Just,
We're back to the Parthenon marbles.
Yeah, we're back to the marbles. To bring it back,
they say that like any historical discussion ever at like, I think it's like World War II or the Nazis eventually, every archaeological discussion ever eventually comes back to the Parthenon marbles.
Yeah.
That's
just the way it is.
Yeah.
To bring it back to Rome as we get to the last couple of topics, I don't want to take up too much of your time.
No, not at all. I'm loving this.
There's the one sort of archaeological thing I ever did. I took a class and I wrote a paper. The professor said, write about your own city where you grew up. What would archaeologists say if they, dug up your city? And where I grew up, one of the places I grew up was a very small town that believed that they invented the hamburger. They believed that this was the place that invented the hamburger. So there's a big statue of this guy I'm so glad you didn't say a big statue of a hamburger. I'm sorry. They do have a giant hamburger grill, and every year they grill a 1,000-pound burger, and they divide it up to everyone in the town. But there's a big statue of this guy, and he's triumphantly holding out on a tray a burger, like he has come down from heaven and gifted the burger to humanity. And I thought, if archaeologists did dig this up 1,000 years from now and they didn't know anything about, they would think we worshiped some kind of harvest god who had given us this, food item. So to make a sort of a lighter question, what do we get wrong in popular culture about Roman religion? The daily religious practice of someone in the core of Rome, in the main Roman Empire or Republic. Yeah, the burger god.
Do you want to know at the back of my mind, and I'm going to say that it was a joke before I say it. I was that close to not saying it was a joke and saying, so have you ever heard about Caesar salad? And just go from there. But no, please, nobody quote me on that. That's just McDonald's 316. To you of this. Just go get you some photo offerings. Yeah, so I think the most clip claims Caesar salad. I didn't say that. I'm not
Don't clip that. Don't clip that, chat.
Finishing the comment, because then you can clip me saying that alone. I think the most the question was the most misunderstood.
What we get wrong about Roman religious belief.
It's malleability and flexibility. I think we see it. Yeah, Monsignor said there, Roman gods are not just Greek copy-paste. Couldn't agree more with that. And I have many friends who study Roman kind of theology and the Orphics and everything. who would argue that there's huge differences. But what I think is the most misunderstood thing, particularly from my point of view, and particularly from an archaeological point of view, and dealing in the period I deal with, it kind of fits into our conversation from on, that flexibility and malleability for the large part was a cornerstone of Roman religious practice, where it fit in with that, what I was saying to you before about, like maintain the status quo. Rome, without it being too blunt, kind of didn't care if you practiced something else or worshipped something else, as long, particularly during the Republic, as long as you adhered to the rules that Rome was setting in place legally. The point in which this changes is the onset of the rise of Christianity towards the end of the 3rd century, mainly, when the doctrine of Christianity, being one of the few monotheistic religions at the time, and Rome had a similar problem with the Jewish faith, was that they were actively not worshipping one particular part of Roman religion. And this is an important distinction to make, and I think it gets kind of lost. The imperial cult is something which comes about, obviously, after Augustus. And it is the worship of Augustus as Divi Filius, as son of a god, as a result of Julius Caesar's deification. This changes everything in Roman religion because it establishes divine agency onto a recently deceased and a currently living. You are now son of a god, which makes you preordained to be a god, which means you deserve the worship of a god. Okay? And this imperial cult becomes one of the widest spreading and quickest spreading cults in the empire. And it particularly takes hold in the Eastern Empire, in Asia Minor, in the Near East, and in North Africa, because of mainly previously Persian and then Macedonian ways of ruling, which was to see the king as Basileus, to see him as this entity that could be worshipped in isolation. And so if you insert the imperial cult into that, it's just another of the same kind of format. So it's gonna take on very quickly. We see the same thing with Mithras and how that sprung up in the East amongst the soldiers. And so when you look at the imperial cult, you have an insisting by the Romans that you must be okay with worshipping potentially a living or recently deceased member of our ruling family as a god. And that is something which balks against Christian ideology in the 3rd century. And as a matter of fact, later on, I think it's it's an edict in 311, I believe. I hope I get that right. In which the wording of the Romans toward as a Christian edict, the wording changes, where they ask the Christians to pray for the emperor rather than to. And that change in wording suddenly levels the playing field for Christians within the empire. Because now they're not asking you to worship the emperor, they're asking you to pray for the emperor in your own manner of worship. And I think that, even though it's at the cusp of Constantine's reforms and eventually the Council of and everything that happens between Arian and Nicene Christian there, I think it marks a very late, but at least better late than never, change that the Romans actively used to do in the BCE period, when they would approach new religions and they would actually adapt and often adopt these gods into either a reminiscent version within their own pantheon with the name, or like we get with like Zeus Ammon, okay, where they kind of hybridize the names, and you get this kind of like, okay, we'll make it fit. And I think that gets overlooked so much in Roman religion and is key to understanding how Romans made their presence religiously palatable to other nations and other peoples. And I think that that's a very important nuance. And I often think it kind of gets lost as much as like some of the other nuance we've talked about gets lost when you use the term Romanization, which I hate. This fact gets lost when you think that what was said in chat there, that like, oh, Roman gods are just Greek gods, they just copied all the gods. It's not quite that. They understood how to integrate and when it was necessary to do so, and they even show that they can kind of accept it even with the Christian God, but after all the damage has been done and when it has become an inevitability, so it's too late. But still, they still show a capability to do it, and this is something that I think gets left out of the conversation, that nuance.
Yeah, because in popular culture, it's like, you know, Zeus, Jupiter, and it's like the red line on the map. It's not a negotiation like the Roman gods seem to actually have been. The Roman religion is a sort of negotiation with an ongoing conversation about what the belief is. Which is so much more interesting.
We often leave out how much Roman is influenced by Etruscan religion. You know, like everyone just thinks, oh, Rome just took the Greek gods, but like Rome takes derivatives of Etruscan gods, and this becomes very obvious in the area that I study, Croatia, because you have indigenous Italic gods, you have Roman gods, you have Etruscan gods, and you have Greek gods, and they all somehow exist in the same space, you know?
The variety is so much more interesting than the static. These are the gods. These are their names. This is where they came from. I'm in the middle of writing a sort of a modern fantasy novel, and I'm using it with a lot of mythology from different cultures in the world. So it sort of presupposes that all of these myths are true. That's just sort of a hidden world, whether it's Kitsune from Japan, Jotun from Scandinavia, Aisling, I think it is, from Ireland. Sort of all of that. I think I'm pronouncing that right, probably not, but
yeah, you're close enough.
Close enough.
Remember when you said it the first time?
Were there sort of, and this is maybe a silly question, but there's no silly questions. Did Romans have sort of cryptids? Were there sort of mythological beings outside of their sort of pantheon of gods? Were there sort of creatures that maybe, well, boogeymen, that they might have told stories to their children, like German might?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but like, oh my God, where do I even start? I think the unknown is a huge driving force in the Roman boogeyman mythos, right? So the edge of the world is a massive point of terror for the Romans. And they talk about, like, if you look at the writings about Britain specifically, they talk about giants and sea monsters. Even Caligula goes as far as when he pretends to invade Britain and he marches his legions up to the English Channel and fires catapults into the water and stabs the beach and then collects seashells and declares victory over Neptune and the sea. When Claudius actually went to invade Britain, he had a mutiny, or almost, because they just would not cross the channel. They saw it as the edge of the world. And this was full of all of those sea monsters that we see in the Odyssey, with Charybdis and Scylla and all of these things, these monstrous Kraken-esque ones that have made their way into even our modern myths, like where we talk Cthulhu. It's like these had derivatives. They have an origin point, and we see them as being a part of maybe Odysseus and his story, but the Romans really put stock in this, and I think you also mentioned a little bit about other peripheral religions taking hold, and I mentioned earlier about Mithras.
Yeah.
And I think Mithras is a great example of too, where it's something that's outside the Roman pantheon, but that makes its way into the Roman pantheon via a non-conventional way, via the army. So there's a plethora. We could be here for another 2 hours talking about all stories, but I think they're often again, they could be dumbed down to be Roman fears are the same thing as what Greeks feared, but I think a lot of it is human nature in a way. We fear what we think of to be the edge of the world. We fear deep water, we fear the dark, we fear death, we fear even if you look at the Lares, and the Lararium in a domus, and the idea of like death masks in the Roman period. I have so much to talk about here. I'm going like a million miles an hour. I'm sorry.
Good.
But like they wear. So there's inscriptions. I'm sorry. There's inscriptions of the male members of families during funerary processions. The ones that look most like the deceased were to wear the funerary mask of the deceased in order to tell the spirit world that that person is still present here with us, right? And then the Lararium, which is the household gods, or the place of the household gods in the domus, and the penates, which are a derivative of the they're in the same usually shrine area domus. These household gods and your ancestral gods are protective spirits. They're supposed to ward off danger. Even like in Pompeii, the large phallic, the ithyphallic symbols that we see around doorways are all danger wardens. They're like, the Romans had this fear of encroaching danger, of spirituality that kind of encroached on the space of the living. This is a very real daily practice. The paterfamilias would lead prayers every day at the Lararium to ward off danger to the family, ward off misfortune. There was this idea, and it derives from the Greek idea of the fates, and the furies, that you can incur the wrath of those you can't see. And then I think that's very human nature. And then at the same time, when you look at geographical things like, as I mentioned, deep sea, Priapus, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, where he's weighing his palace as a good luck charm. It's also a ward of danger. It's also to ward off danger. When you look at like geographic boundaries, like the English Channel, you get a very real, historiographically attested to limits of the Roman mentality, where they mutinied rather than face sea monsters. It's very real. It's very present for them every single day. And that's something that I think we also underestimate a little bit, was how religion was not religion like we see it. It was a lived, daily practiced experience. It didn't exist only in a church or a basilica or a cathedral. It existed in your home. It existed around you in your daily practice. The temple was the house of the god. The temple it was where you could pray, but it wasn't where you should only pray. You should actively celebrate constantly. You should actively honor constantly. It was a lived experience. I doubt the Romans saw religion as a separate entity, just daily life, so intrinsically linked. And thus, it can be so malleable.
And I'm so glad to have heard that explanation, because sometimes I get the impression from people that, well, the Romans didn't take religion all that seriously. They had these gods, but it was just sort of, it wasn't like a factor in their daily lives. But that seems like it's totally the opposite. Like, it was actually an integral part rather than just a separate religious thing.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's actually a perfect way to phrase it, is that it's not separate from their existence. So therefore, when we try to study it in isolation, we're almost doing it, because we need to understand that it is a part of the daily activity. It's not a thing you go and do and then come back from and resume your life. It is existentially intertwined with your very practice. And as a result, I suppose it's understandable how that can be seen as because we don't have Sunday congregations. There was a festival. Yeah. Almost half the Roman calendar is religious festival, right? So at the same time, you can say, well, there's no communal gathering every week honoring takes place. And the Romans make a point. Pliny makes a point of saying this about the Christians. They gather once a week to share and break bread. And basically, he basically tells Trajan that it's they're kind of chill, there's nothing really happening here, and that stands out to the Romans because it's a fixed thing. And we tend to look at religion as this like fixed entity, this fixed thing. It's not. It's how you choose to behave for a temporally limited space of time, potentially. The Romans, it's this constantly negotiated lived experience, and so as a result, it can often be quite hard to find in a way, because often it's very hard to differentiate from just everything else you find, because it just is. And hence the archaeological joke that if we don't know what something is, it's a ritual thing.
Yeah. Melissa made that point a couple times in our conversation as well. Like they found something that looked like a metal pillow, and they're like, I don't know what this is. It must be for ritual purposes. It's a religious icon or relic or something. We're just looking at it from our, as you talked about before, looking at it from our 2,000 years later. We expect a religious thing to be these fixed points and worship to happen in a particular way that we're so used to, and then they're doing it so differently.
I should also point out I have far more educated colleagues on the intricacies of Greco-Roman religious practice, and I would never claim to be an expert on it in any way. But what I think, because I mainly work on the funerary, let's call it like the funerary space. Okay, I've brought it up a few times throughout this talk, that like the construction of funerary space. And one thing which I wrote about recently, haven't sent it for peer review yet, which is about the part that we miss in the ancient funeral is all of the funeral. Does that make sense? Do you get what I mean by that?
Yeah.
It's all the procession. It's all the preparation. It's all the mourning, the lamentation, the burial. And then we miss the aftermath. How does the lived community interact with the dead? Like, we don't know how many times they visit. Do they visit? Do they leave flowers? We don't know. We just don't know this consistently enough to make sweeping statements about it. We don't know what the lived relationship was between the dead and the living, and how that is negotiated within the daily life and religion. Because if we're to go by the Lorarium and the Penates and the funerary masks, almost, they have an active daily part to play. But do we actually, would they see it that way? Would they see it that, their father is buried outside the main gate? Is he as much there as he is with his death mask with the Lararium? Maybe not. It's so hard to reach for that, and it is a reach, and you have to acknowledge it, that it's a reach to try and make those assumptions, and it's really difficult to because at the end of the day, necropolis in the ancient world are placed outside the city for sanitary reasons. That's ultimately why, and eventually the city often consumes them within its urban framework, within its urban sprawl. And like, obviously the sanitary thing it becomes less important, it becomes more metaphorically important, like where you're separating the lived space from the space of the dead, and that aligns with like the pomerium, like in extent of the city, and what's inside versus what's outside the pomerium, and that's a totally negotiated well. But this also extends just to polis states as well, where when you have a necropolis and you have the place of the dead, well, like, is that somewhere that is always bustling with people, or is it not? Or yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you did, Bior. And I think that questioning of that relationship is something that we should try and reach for more. Is like, what was the whole process? We know the names for the ceremony on the run up to a funeral. What did it actually entail? We all know about the famous fact that Romans used to hire women to cry because it would be uncouth for the actual matron of the family to cry at a funeral. We all know these things. These things are passed down to us in the sources, and we know from the literature. But like, maybe it wasn't when you're the baker's wife. Maybe you can't afford the whole ensemble. Maybe you just cried, and maybe that's a reality that we need to, that human element is something that we need to reach for too. And I think that also exists in how we interacted with the dead after they're dead. And that is a relationship. Even though it's technically one-sided, it's still a relationship. And that is intrinsically linked with religion and daily practice.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 2,000-year reach, but it's like that's the important reach. We have the relics, we have certain things written down, we have, like you said, names of things, but what was it actually like to be there and in that space? I only have one more thing that I want to ask, because we could go on, like you've been saying, for hours, and there's so many things that would be interesting to talk about. But
any one of our conversations could have been this whole thing.
Could be a whole lecture. But as a health teacher, I try to ask one health-related question, and that's in this case, for someone in history, Roman supplements or potions, or because I was in that space and like debunking all the crap that's out there, and I do lessons about that and what's real and what's not, and most of it is garbage. But did they have that sort of, like, you go to an apothecary and here's an elixir, a magic elixir that will a panacea that will cure your erectile dysfunction or whatever?
I'm so sorry, Monsignor posting garum is all you need. Do you know what garum is? It's the fish oil. It smells horrendous in the Roman period, and the fact that was the comment, I just had this envisaged. Cure your ED with garum. It's like, oh god.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Yes is the answer to your question. They absolutely. There's been entire works done on Roman witchcraft as a playful title. Okay. In fact, I had a friend who, when I was doing my undergrad, she was doing her master's in archaeology, and she was going to go on from doing her master's in archaeology to do an undergrad and a master's in biochem. And then she was going to go, and she did it. I know she did it because I texted her, I would say maybe 2 years ago, and she was in the midst of her PhD on Roman medicine. And she had used biochemical science and classical archaeology in order to come up with a PhD thesis on the potential chemical ingredients of Roman medicinal practices. And it was phenomenal how she did it. And I must reach out to her again. I don't know if I presume she finished. I presume she did. She finished everything else she did. So, like, I hope it turned out as good as the potential was. I have another friend who works on perfumes and the market for Roman perfumes and Greek perfumes, and how, because I work an awful lot with ceramics, and how there is two markets simultaneously happening at the same time, where if you have a Versace perfume and it has the picture of Medusa on it, and you think, oh, the bottle's really cool, it's like that, translucent kind of blue, it's like a sapphire blue, and you're like, oh, that's kind of nice, and also it smells great, fantastic. She has determined that there is a market for the ceramics to be shaped like the smell they're containing, or have depictions of the smell on them, right? Or the ingredients, perhaps, so blossoms. And then she looked at the chemical residue on the inside of the perfume ceramics, and it matches scientifically. So there's two markets happening at once. You're marketing visual, and you're marketing to your sense of smell, right? Your desire for the scent. And so yes is the answer to your question. There is so much work being done, so much great work by great scientists and great people who are doing work on Joanne Florin. I will reach out to her, actually, now that I've talked about her again. It's been a long time since I've talked to her. I will reach out and I will ask her for, and see if she'd be okay sharing it. I presume she's done, but I will actually. There's so much work being done on apothecaries, ancient medicine, ancient perfumes, markets for ceramics, markets for proclivity of soothsayers and remedies in the ancient world, that I think it's good. I think there's some good work about to come out on all this, which I think will be of real benefit to us, because a lot of these people are not just historians taking an educated guess. They are also biochemical scientists who are coming at this from a point of view of medicine and accessibility to materials. And I think that's just absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. Because I asked Melissa the same thing, and that was also so important to the ancient Egyptians. But that was a question that I always have to ask of my guests: how we can tie it to health, and there's so much more that we could talk about. But I don't want. We've already gone.
There's nothing more important to the Roman or the Greeks than health and well-being, and I think you can just look at the ancient city of Rome to see that. You look at depictions on ceramics of strigils, and when they're like oiling themselves and scraping it off. You look at the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer in Rome, which is up until like the mid 20th century was still a functioning secondary reserve sewer for the city. Two and a half millennia later, you look at the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Titus, and you say they were free to the public. And there was also private bathhouses. There was hundreds of bathhouses around the city of Rome. It's a staple of Roman culture. And the idea of exercising nude, the palaestra, the Greek ideology of perfection in the body and honoring the body as a temple, the health, well-being. You look at cults like the cult of Asclepius, where you have hundreds and thousands of choroplastic terracotta limbs, hands, fingers, phalloi, babies, breasts. You have everything in there that are offered as representatives of if you broke your finger, or you were trying for a baby, or your child wasn't suckling, or you broke your nose, or your uncle was limping, or you have walking canes and everything. They have whole cults dedicated to restoring and maintaining physical, well, relative, I suppose, to your age, but physical ability and perfection as much as you possibly can. It doesn't take that much of a look into the ancient world to see, particularly in the Greco-Roman world, to see that health and well-being, even if it wasn't seen as some sort of universal human right, it did almost come across as like an accessible to all kind of thing, where it mightn't have been policy, but it certainly was kind of commonplace enough for it to become a cultural staple, which I think says everything you kind of need to know about what else might be less of a cultural staple, but absolutely present and adjacent to that mentality.
Yeah, it seems like they really idolized the idea of physical perfection, and one of the things I did talk about was with her was the Olympiads and the diets and the herbal things that the participants would take, and then people would see that and say, I'm going to do that because if it works for these amazing athletes that have these amazing bodies, I want to do that. They're obviously the picture of health, and that's how that kind of thing spreads. Communal toilets complete with sponge on a stick, Monsignor says.
Yes, of course. And then there's that.
Yeah, and then we have that. At any rate, again, we could go on forever, and this is such a interesting conversation. Really, one of the most interesting topics that we had in our seminar series. We are going to head into a raid. We're going to bring our class to another class. I want to thank our guest, General Stee, so much for indulging us and spending so much time explaining so many really cool and interesting facts about history. But before we go out, let everybody know what you're up to next, where they can find you, where they can watch you, when you typically stream.
So actually I have had the most changeable schedule for the last month and a half because it's coming to the end of teaching, and I can tell you next week is the last bunch of classes for the semester, so I will be just out to correcting. So I usually stream in a good world. I stream 3-4 times a week, usually towards the end of the week. I usually do historical content or historical games. I think today we just started a Warhammer 3 campaign. I'm also just a giant generally, so usually the historical conversation just weaves around playing. We are playing a really cool game called The Seance of Blake Manor, which is set in Ireland in the late 19th century. It's really cool. It's like a gothic horror game, but I love it because it's so culturally attuned to Ireland. So you can see me there on Twitch. I'm also on YouTube and everything, but mainly I'm on Twitch. I can put my link in chat, or you can click the name there if you feel like following. I'd love to see some of you guys around.
Absolutely.
We tried to do like a history once a week as well, if I can. It's just been a little bit hard recently in my eyes, but yeah, hopefully after next week things will calm down. So hopefully see some of you there. Would love that.
Would love to see you there, and we will have additional seminar series once a month. If you again are an educational streamer, check out the Knowledge Fellowship. We would love to see you there. We would love to help highlight and promote your work to get substantive educational content out into the live streaming world. Thank you so much for being here today. We're gonna head out on our raid. Thank you all for being here. I have been Mr. Aegis, our guest, General Steve. We will see you all next time. Be well. That's all we have for you today. Class dismissed.